Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you that are here today to the Board of Commissioners and Planning Board joint meeting. Can you do the roll call for me, please, Elizabeth?
Mayor Harker.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Gillikin.
Here.
Commissioner Cooper.
Here.
Commissioner Matthews.
Here.
Commissioner LaPiccolo.
Here.
Commissioner Spiegler.
Here.
Ryan Neve.
Here.
Victor Vasilino.
Here.
Tammy Hunsucker. Clark Patton.
Here.
George Stanzio. Jeff Rungenhill. And Cameron White will not be able to join us.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got an agenda in front of us, short but sweet, and can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
We've got a motion on the floor. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Well, first, I would like to welcome the members of the Planning Board, and thank you for taking the time out to join us today. It's always a great opportunity to work with you together, and we thank you for all that you do for the town of Beaufort. Now, today we are continuing the town's Unified Development Ordinance Update, Module 4, and focusing on two important areas: reorganizing and modernizing our subdivision regulations and updating our flood damage prevention ordinance. The packet explains that in great detail, so if you're following online, please go ahead and take a look at that. The packet also explains that the UDO Steering Committee, legal counsel, and members of the public through an online process has had an opportunity to weigh in on this. Our purpose today is to build onto that work and not necessarily adopt a final ordinance. We are here to understand the proposed changes, identify questions or revisions that remain, and to give clear guidance and directions to the staff and the project consultant. We also have a second responsibility today to discuss the next phase of the UDO update and to provide directions regarding the scope and sequence of the work that remains. When you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand so that we can go ahead and recognize you. I want this to be a very balanced and collaborative session. I want everybody's opinions to be valued and heard. So if we haven't heard you or if you haven't been able to make a comment, please make sure that we are addressing you. A community conversation will be held immediately after this joint work session, providing an additional opportunity for the public to discuss and provide feedback. My hope is at the end of this work session, we have a clear understanding as to where we can agree, what revisions or follow-up informations are still needed, and how we want to see the next steps proceed. So with that being said, I would like to turn it over to the project consultant and our staff to begin the presentation.
Good evening, Commissioners and Board. Thank you so much for joining us again for a joint meeting. I think this will be a really good collaborative discussion for Module 4. This is including the subdivision regulations and the flood damage prevention ordinance. I know that it's a little bit more fun for the subdivision regulations. That's where we can have a little bit more local flair. Our flood damage prevention ordinance is largely written for us by the state and feds with that model ordinance. The language isn't as move-aroundable. That's a technical term. So I really appreciate everyone being here and doing something a little bit different. And I look forward to hearing from everyone tonight at the board and then also over on the other side for the community conversation afterward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Good evening, Mayor Harker, commissioners, and planning board members. It's a pleasure to be back with you all tonight to talk about our latest work on the Unified Development Ordinance. As you have already stated, we're looking at the subdivision regulations and the flood damage prevention ordinance. This is what has happened so far in this module. We met back in May with the steering committee to review the proposed changes to the flood damage prevention ordinance. We met in person in June to talk about the subdivision regulations and conducted our first community conversation at Beaufort Elementary School. And then the committee had a handful of issues that they wanted to discuss further. So we met virtually at the end of July and then produced a revised draft that incorporates the steering committee's input, and that was posted online August 10th. Yes, sir. So I'm going to go through the major proposed changes. Of course, if there's anything else that you all want to discuss or have questions on, we're happy to answer those. So this is how Article 5 is organized. It starts with some general subdivision standards that apply to all subdivisions. There's a section for required improvements that cover things like curb and gutter, pedestrian and bicycle facilities. Then there's a section on streets, open space, and then we have two sections that pertain to subdivision design. So cluster subdivision is something that you all currently have that we've expanded a bit, and then the townhouse subdivision design standards are new. And then at the end is the performance guarantees. So first I'll touch on blocks and lots. We've proposed to revise the block length standard to have a minimum of 400 feet and a maximum of 1,320 feet, which is, what, a quarter of a mile, eighth of a mile, to a maximum of 8 times the district minimum lot width. So if your district minimum lot width is 50 feet, your minimum block or your maximum block length would be 400 feet. And this was a recommendation from the steering committee. This was a topic that they discussed during both of their meetings. The draft also requires a mid-block pedestrian connection when a block exceeds 600 feet in length. And so this is a paved sort of multi-use path that would run in between lots in the middle of the block just to provide additional pedestrian and bicycle connectivity. The draft also maintains a requirement that all new lots must front a public or private street. And of course, it does still allow for access easements to existing landlocked parcels, but new lots have to have frontage on a street. We have created a distinction between major and minor subdivisions, which is common in most of the communities we work in. Everybody defines minor subdivision a little bit differently. The threshold can be 3, 5, 7, 10, whatever is appropriate. Here we've proposed 5 or fewer lots constitutes a minor subdivision. And the plan for this is to have a separate administrative review process, so a staff level review process for these minor subdivisions. They require frontage on an existing public street. So minor subdivisions by definition do not have new public streets. They do not require open space, which major subdivisions do. They do require street lighting and street trees. And then a couple of the required improvements are context specific, and this was a result of discussion at the steering committee. Curb and gutter, so if the street the minor subdivision is located on has curb and gutter, but for some reason there is not curb and gutter in front of where the proposed lots will be located, the developer has to extend that curb and gutter in front of their lots. Same thing for bicycle and pedestrian facilities, so mainly sidewalks. So if there's an existing sidewalk on the street, it has to continue in front of the minor subdivision lots, or if there is a pedestrian or bicycle facility identified in the comprehensive transportation plan or the town's parks and rec master plan, that would have to be a part of a minor subdivision. So that leads me into this table, which summarizes the required improvements by minor or major subdivision. And you'll notice most of the improvements are required in both minor and major subdivisions, except for boat ramps or docks and open space. And again, those couple curb and gutter and ped and bike facilities are context specific. So I'm not going to go through all of these required improvements, but I will just touch on a few where we've proposed some major changes. With pedestrian and bicycle facilities, we've expanded sidewalk requirements. The current LDO only requires sidewalks on one side of the street in subdivisions with 10,000 square foot lots or greater. After discussion with the steering committee, we've proposed to require sidewalks on both sides of the street when the subdivision includes lots that are less than or equal to 12,000 square feet. And then if the lots are larger than 12,000 square feet, sidewalk is only required on one side. However, when there's a cul-de-sac, the sidewalk does have to go all the way around the cul-de-sac and connect back to the other sidewalk. The draft increases the minimum sidewalk width from 4 feet to 5 feet and enhances pedestrian crosswalk requirements. Streetlights are required, and we've added some standards that are recommended by Dark Sky International's Luminaires program guidelines. And then we've added maintenance standards for these required improvements when they'll be privately owned to make sure that they are maintained over the long term. I wanted to talk about open space in a little bit more detail because this significantly expands the provisions in the current LDO, which are under Section 34I, public facilities. We've established a menu of open space types, each of which has a minimum size, and that helps ensure that the open space is of meaningful size and it's actually usable. Required open space for a development has to include at least 2 types of open space, including at least 50% active recreation area. The town has a calculation for the amount of open space that's required, and I'll show that on the next slide, but we've proposed to increase the level of service from 8 acres per 1,000 people population to 12.9 acres. This is a national average. It comes from the National Recreation and Park Association. They've found that communities with a population less than 20,000, the average amount of parks provided is 12.9 acres per 1,000 people. The town's Park and Recreation Comprehensive Plan recommends establishing a local level of service for parks, but since the town doesn't currently have that, we felt that using that national standard from the NRPA was a rational connection. So here is the calculation. So in any development or any subdivision, major subdivision, you have to have at least a half acre of open space, or this calculation that's based on the number of dwelling units or lots in the subdivision, the average household size, which we have updated to current demographic information, which is 1.95. The park's level of service, which I mentioned we've proposed increasing from 8 to 12.9, and then this variable density factor that's based on the average acreage per lot or dwelling unit. So that calculation staying the same as it currently is today, we've just updated 2 of the numbers in that. The draft generally carries forward the town's criteria for open space selection and specifically identifies areas that do not count as open space. It requires preservation of cultural resource areas, requires this open space to be maintained as open space in perpetuity, and it carries forward fee and lieu provisions, but only allows this option for the active recreation area. So all other open space would have to be provided on site. Moving into the next section on streets, we've added a prohibition on gated subdivisions per input from the steering committee, and this applies whether the streets are private or public. It adds criteria for when the Board of Commissioners may allow alleys in residential subdivisions, and it removes the current prohibition on private streets, and this was a topic that the steering committee discussed at length and recommended further discussion on. So just a couple of things on private streets. All private streets would still have to be designed and constructed to NCDOT standards. The street signs would have to include a notation that they are private so that it's clear just by looking at the street sign whether they're public or private. There's an access easement required to the benefit of the town to accommodate trash collection, emergency services, code enforcement, that sort of thing. Does require a maintenance agreement, and again, based on conversations at the steering committee, there's an express prohibition on public acceptance. I mentioned the cluster subdivision design earlier. So this is one that definitely needs further discussion. The steering committee talked about it, but didn't come to a recommendation on whether to expand this subdivision design to other zoning districts, either as optional or required. We also talked a little bit about the desired incentives for this. What would make a developer choose this subdivision design type over a conventional subdivision design? So in terms of applicability, currently and in the draft, cluster subdivision is required in the RC5 zoning district. And you can see there's not a lot of RC5 in the town. It's that sort of bluish purple color that you can kind of see best in the large parcel in that top image. That's the color. And so the question here is, Do you require cluster subdivision design as the only subdivision design in other zoning districts? Do you allow it as an option in other zoning districts? And then the design type requires increased open space. It requires the homes or the lots to be clustered in groups of 15 or fewer houses with open space, green space interspersed between those cluster groups. And it requires an interconnected pedestrian system as well as perimeter buffer yards around the perimeter of the development. So if the UDO expands applicability of this subdivision type, we need to talk about what types of incentives would be appropriate. So the committee discussed allowing increased impervious surface area on individual lots, but noted that incentive only makes sense if impervious surface limits are added to the base zoning districts, and we may or may not be able to do that with the downzoning legislation. The committee also discussed using a different calculation of density, like using gross site acreage versus how you calculate it for conventional subdivisions, which is gross site acreage minus wetlands, roads, et cetera. And then another potential incentive is reduced or no minimum lot area, which potentially allows for a greater lot yield in the development and less linear footage of infrastructure like roads and drainage and water and sewer lines, which can obviously save on cost. Townhouse subdivision design is new, and it would apply to all new townhouse subdivisions. It requires rear alley access for narrower subdivision lots. So if it's less than 24 feet wide, they would not have a driveway in the front. They'd have to be accessed through an alley at the rear of the lot. Has a requirement for outdoor living areas with minimum sizes. At least 10% of the individual townhouse dwelling units in the subdivision would have to front on some sort of open space, neighborhood park, linear open space. It requires off-street guest parking areas, and there's a ratio, I think it's 1 per 3 dwelling units, interspersed throughout the development to capture overflow parking and guest parking. There are some driveway standards that are intended to limit the amount of paving that happens in front of units, because what we see a lot in townhouse subdivisions is you have to have a double width driveway, which is, probably at least 20 feet or so, and the lots aren't that much wider, so in a lot of places we've seen you end up with basically just pavement across the front yard. So we're trying to implement some standards that will help mitigate that. And also when the lots are not alley served, when they have front driveways, there's a requirement for shared solid waste garbage collection points. Last thing in the subdivision regulations I'll touch on is performance guarantees. So this carries forward and reorganizes the town's current requirements for performance guarantees. And we've made some updates where it's noted in the document footnotes for consistency with state law changes that happened in 2024. We've also added provisions for partial release of performance guarantees, which was a recommendation in the codes assessment that we did in phase 1 of this project. So flood damage prevention, this is the only component of the future UDO that is not part of the current LDO. As Michelle mentioned, it's based on federal regulations, and it's largely verbatim from the state's model ordinance, which was recently updated. This draft that is before you tonight has been reviewed by the state, and we have incorporated all of their feedback based on the most recent model ordinance that came out. The model ordinance provides some areas for optional language for higher standards, but otherwise is intended to be adopted as is to ensure compliance with state and federal regulations. So we have included those edits to comply with the model ordinance. We've included a number of optional standards from the model ordinance, increased freeboard requirements, which is one of the most significant changes. There's been a slight reorganization and then just some minor edits for consistency with the rest of the UDO. I'm going to focus on these 3 bullet points that are highlighted on the screen. Starting with the slight reorganization, this is really just for consistency with how we've organized the rest of the UDO. So we have the administration and definitions at the back, and the more substantive standards at the front. Next, I'm going to go through the optional standards. So the draft that's before you tonight includes all 6 of these optional standards. The first prohibits fully enclosed areas below the lowest floor or the lowest horizontal member from being temperature controlled. The next is to require breakaway walls to have flood openings that allow for the automatic entry and exit of floodwaters. While this is optional for the flood damage prevention ordinance, it's required by the North Carolina Building Code and the Residential Code, so we've included that. There's a requirement for an operational and maintenance plan if floodproofing, non-residential floodproofing is used to meet the regulatory flood protection elevation requirements. For floodproofing certificates, require a registered professional engineer or architect to certify that that finished construction complies with the requirements for VE and coastal A zone construction. For the town issues a CO, a certificate of occupancy. The draft requires an elevation certificate prior to the actual start of any new construction. And the definition of recreational vehicle clarifies that tiny homes on a chassis that meet the definition of a recreational vehicle are regulated as RVs, but if they don't meet those standards, then they have to comply as a residential structure. Getting to freeboard, so proposed is to increase the required freeboard from 1 foot to 2 feet for areas with a base flood elevation, as recommended in the CAMA land use plan, and also to increase the elevation requirement for areas without a base flood elevation from 2 feet to 3 feet. So these changes actually are within the definition of regulatory flood protection elevation. And freeboard in general is optional, but at least 1 foot is required to maintain the town's community rating system, Class 7. So we define base flood elevation, which is established by the flood insurance study. It's established by FEMA. Freeboard is the amount of additional height that's added to that base flood elevation. And then the regulatory flood protection elevation, how high you have to elevate a structure, is the base flood elevation plus the freeboard. So here again, base flood elevation plus 2 feet. There are a number of potential benefits for increased freeboard, including risk reduction beyond the regulatory minimum, potentially lower flood insurance premiums, get CRS credit and reduced community-wide premiums, reduced repetitive loss exposure, accounting for future conditions, and potentially reduced disaster recovery burden. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it to Tyson for next steps, or do we want to do? Okay. Okay. If y'all, thank you. If y'all are okay, we can go through those drafts and questions, and then at the end come back to this section.
No, let's see what the board would like to see. Would you like to ask questions before they move on, or yes?
I just have a question really about the process.
Okay.
So today, what are you seeking from the board? Because I have, as you know, a whole list of comments and questions on this draft. That would take a really long time to go through all of those in a meeting format, because I'm sure everybody has a similar amount of questions. So like, what are you looking for us tonight? How many questions? That sort of thing.
It's really up to y'all. We're here to answer any questions and take your input as long as you all want to be here. We are seeking your direction on where we go from here, honestly, whether it's, under our original plan, we would take all your input and comments received on this draft and fold them into the final draft. But after we talk about kind of what our options are with that downzoning legislation in mind, that's going to dictate sort of where we go and kind of how we might handle a next draft or when we would incorporate.
But for just these two sections tonight that don't have anything to do with downzoning, do you want to go like word for word through the draft tonight, or that would be too tedious?
I'm really looking to y'all for that direction. We'll do it whatever your preference is.
Well, let's back it up and probably go into small chunks. You've covered the first two sections before we go on to the UDO next steps. And let's go back to the very beginning real quickly and see if anybody has any questions before they actually lose their momentum a little bit. So we've got subdivision regulations before we moved on to the flood zoning hazards. So we've had a couple of sections there. So does anybody have any questions about the first section that had been covered that's not about the flooding? Yes, Mr. Running Hill.
Just the minor subdivisions, the ones that allow administrative approval, said 5 lots or less. Is there an acreage required tied to the 5 lots or less?
Not in the current draft, no.
So it can be 50 acres of 10-acre lots, or it can be
Well,
past an administrative review.
Well, under the statute, 10-acre lots are exempt subdivision, so if they're smaller than 10 acres.
So 40-acre lots, top 8 acres apiece. The staff could review that and have a road and all of it, and nobody sees it but staff.
So if you're building a new road, that makes it a major subdivision. So the draft defines a minor subdivision as it results in 5 or fewer lots, including any residual portion of the parent parcel. They're located on an existing public street, and all lots have frontage on that street. The draft says do not propose to create new public improvements, but we need to strike that because, as I mentioned earlier, there's street lights and street trees and potentially sidewalks that are required. So, and then the last condition is that they don't require a variance. So as long as you meet those 3, it would be a minor subdivision approved or reviewed and acted upon at staff level. Thus the proposal anyways. But the procedure has not been drafted. It's not in the subdivision regulations. It would be in the procedures article, which is a different module. We haven't drafted that yet.
Commissioner Matthews? Questions, Anthony? Do you have a question?
Good. More of a statement, I guess, at this point, and back to Commissioner Spiegler's comments. I have a couple of areas that are very broad, that'll cover both of the floodplain and the subdivision. 2 of them would, and then 1 of them is specific to the floodplain damage prevention ordinance. And then when I got into detail in reviewing it, I've got all kinds of
Questions?
areas, questions, comments, some of the regulations that didn't quite, are not clear, that needs greater clarity, that needs to be brought to it, so on and on and on and on. And quite frankly, I would make my list, and then I would start reading again. My list would get longer, and then it would get longer, and then it would get longer. So if we, and it continues to grow because I'm going back through it again, quite frankly. So I'm wondering how you do want to proceed, just like Commissioner Spiegler was saying. Do we want to comment broadly to give some direction in the way of moving forward? I'm planning on having all of my comments typed up so I can submit them into staff so they can review it. Probably will need to meet with them to go through a lot of them, and maybe they would be able to answer some of them that would drop down the list to some degree. But I'm wondering how far we want to go tonight. Do we want to try to be a little broader tonight with our direction that we would like to see based upon what we've read, and perhaps submit something in that's more detailed, which also would give us the opportunity to move forward with the second part of this and hear from the community?
That's a possibility, but I think we're all here today. We're here to listen to what you have to say, and if you could just think of maybe your top 5 questions that you may have. We're going to have more on top of that and on top of that, and I believe those can be sent directly to staff after this. But if you want to have some value in today's meeting, if you have any questions that come to mind, that rises to the top level of your list. Let's see if we can hit those points and then email in the rest of those laundry lists of things that you have questions about. How's that?
Thank you.
Commissioner?
I don't really have questions. It's more, I think, I want to discuss the points for the most part in the draft, right? I mean, there's some questions, like, for example, one question I have is I don't really understand cluster development, so that would be a question like, can you explain that to me more? But a lot of the other things I have is, well, I don't really I think we need to tighten up this language on this page, or I would actually like to see this many sidewalks, not this. So those are all very specific. I would like to see that, but do we want to go through each of those bullet points today and discuss all of them? We'd probably be here till midnight or later, and I don't think any of us want to do that. So it's really how do we proceed tonight, and then in the longer term, I think this is the first time this whole group has seen these sections. So I don't think that we're going to come to a conclusion tonight like, okay, we're finished with this. I think we all have a lot of things that are very important to us that we want discussed, and we're not really under a huge time pressure that it's got to be done by the end of this week.
And it's not have to be done by the end of this meeting either.
Yeah.
So, once again, if you feel like you want to reserve your comments for an email, you could do that. But if you want to actually ask something here today, it's your time. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of the conversation. It's just, once again, reviewing what they have done here today, try to give them the best direction. And we're going to continue this conversation because this is first touch point to this, correct? And hopefully we can continue to do it together collectively. So I don't believe this would be our last collective meeting on this particular topic. So by the time we belabor the process, we could have had a couple of questions on board. So let's do the best that we can in the time that we have. But I do want to do it section by section. So we've got subdivision. Is there anything in the subdivision that Ms. Cousineau has covered? Definition, if you want to get a definition out today, that's a good comment to make. Is there anything that anybody feels? Ms. Hunsucker?
I have a general question more.
You're speaking to the
I have a
mic?
general question regards to you working with other communities in terms of the fee in lieu of open space. I like, what's been your experience? Is this tight enough? Is it going to have too much gray area?
I'll speak broadly, and if it raises a more specific question, just ask that, and I'll try to get a little deeper. Fee in lieu in North Carolina for every city and county is guided by the statute 160D, 804D. It's not a model of clarity in terms of what can be required and what it really means when you talk about the types of parks, et cetera. Some local governments have special legislation that augment that general authority, which is helpful in those jurisdictions. For example, you've seen in the draft, which is what you have in your current LDO, that a fee in lieu is based on the value according to tax assessment. Apex, for example, where we're doing some work, has a special legislation that says they don't have to base it on that. They can base it on actual costs or other things. So what we've done here is we've tried to reflect the input from the subcommittee, which was generally that there be a preference for dedication of land, or not dedication, but set aside of a park on the parcel, which I understand from staff is generally what you're seeing more of anyway. So the fee in lieu would be, if that's not feasible or last resort, we've heard that sort of comment, in that case. So that's some background. Do you have a more specific?
Anytime anything's gray, I'm a little nervous in terms of how it might be used in the future. So
Yeah, no, great point, me too. I will say, the formula that the town has in its current ordinance and what we've got in the draft is more detailed than what some communities have, which I like having. So I think it's in there on the more detailed end of the spectrum, probably.
Mr. Fasolino?
I'd like to just comment on that. I think in the steering committee, we were concerned about the automatic ability to pay a fee in lieu of open space. And let me just read the one chapter that we've clarified that. if the Board of Commissioners determines, after a review and recommendation by the Planning Board, that reservation of open space is not feasible for a particular subdivision or is not compatible with the town's comprehensive plan, the developer may pay a fee in lieu of providing open space. But that puts the jurisdiction to allow that on the Board of Commissioners rather than the developer comes in and says, well, I'm not providing open space, here's $10,000.
Yeah. Yes,
Can I
Mr. Sam.
follow up on that?
please do.
I've never been a big proponent of fee in lieu because usually things don't get done. I mean, it goes into some account somewhere and it builds, and then the onus is on the city. You know, some municipalities allow fee in lieu for sidewalk or fee in lieu for whatever, and usually it just never gets done. So I'm not a big proponent of fee in lieu. And just as a follow-up to, and one of my top fives here is that there are many references in here about the planning director or the commissioners approving this or approving that. I'm very concerned about that because I'm concerned about consistency. And if you don't have consistency in making decisions about allowing somebody to do something or not, I just feel like you're opening up yourself for lawsuits in the future. And so you know, this article is very heavy on that. And commissioners become, you know, sort of a staff review group, to be honest with you. And I think you have to be really, really careful about that. There's just a lot of that in here. And the same for the planning director. I mean, you know, are you going to remember what you allowed somebody to do 3 years ago in the same situation or not? And are you going to make the same decision given the same conditions? So I would really like to, at least for the committee, to talk about that because it's bothersome to me. I feel like it's unusual to be frank with you.
Okay.
You know, in many municipalities, site plans, for instance, that these would apply to, don't even go to elected boards. It's you know, it's usually a staff review. So here we do, you do, planning board does review site plans, and we usually have a bunch of comments. And at the end of the day, it's up to you all to make the final decision. And I'm a little nervous about that. One thing I'd like to see in here, and in the entire UDO, is more graphics. You know, professionals aren't the only ones that actually use these articles. And I found over the years with UDOs, and I've been through many UDO rewrites, that there's a lot more clarity when there are graphics associated with how things are supposed to be calculated or what something should look like, or like these little, you know, block length graphics that you have in here are always helpful, things like that. And I'd like to see that through the entire UDO. Can I keep going?
Yes, please.
I have questions about building height. I know that over the last
few years, we've talked about how we calculate building height in Beaufort. And it's very unusual, for instance, to calculate building height to the peak of a roof. It's usually to the midpoint of the slope of a roof, more usually. So I'd like to, and that's not really in here. I don't know where that would be, or if we're intending to keep it the same, but I'd like to see it changed. I'm also concerned about how do you, if you say that building height is 35 feet, how does that apply to buildings in the areas where you have to elevate a structure? Is it still 35 feet? Because it probably isn't. And I think we have maybe a few examples of that even on Front Street, to be honest. So I'd like to see more about that. And then what other building components are allowed to be beyond, if it's 35 feet, are there other elements of the structure that are allowed to be above that? And that's usually clarified in an ordinance. Let's see. Yeah, I'd like to be a little more specific about what is provided in the active parks and recreation areas. And then in the flood prevention areas, it talks a lot about soil and soil structure, and how buildings relate to that, how things are calculated. And I'm wondering who is responsible for reviewing that, or even who's responsible for preparing that information. For instance, is it a structural engineer? Is it a geotechnical engineer who really understands soils, strength of soils? So there's a question about that. And let's see. Sarah, like you, I've got many questions, as you might guess. I'll stop at that right now.
Okay. Commissioner Cooper?
Yes, thank you.
Get back to you.
I have to be somewhat in agreement with George there about consistency. We're about to lose some part of our consistency with Kyle leaving, because he know where all the bodies are buried. And that's to say that when a new person come on, just like George was stating, if you allow one developer to do something, 4 years later, is that going to be remembered as to what the other person was allowed to do or not to do? So if we're going to say yea or nay to a developer says, well, I'd rather pay, like you say, pay the fine rather than doing what our UDO might be asking them to do, or a camera. That's not consistency when somebody else come along and say, well, I'll do it. But I know we're, and I really wasn't planning on saying anything, but George, he sparked the light on that one. I have to agree with him pretty much on that, because I basically was just coming here to listen. But let me go with this in terms of what be considered taking of property and telling a property or a developer what he can or can't do. I may be on the fence with that, but if we're going to be consistent, we have to be consistent. And I agree with George on that, is that I don't think we should put a fine on it. If our thing is going to be saying that you must, then you must.
Mr. Neve, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I've got a lot of notes on improvements, but there are 5 things that are specifically policy that it would probably be good to see what the town wants to do on these, and I'll try to go through these quickly. On page 14 and 5.3.1, it says that R8 districts are exempt from street trees and street lighting, and it seems like they shouldn't be exempt from street trees and street lighting. I don't know if, on section 5.4 on page 26, where we talk about traffic, quite often in the past 15, 20 years that I've been doing this, we have development comes in, and as the planning board says, we need a traffic study. And then that's another month in the process, and then the traffic study often isn't that impactful. So what I would like to see in here perhaps is some automatic triggers that trigger a preemptive traffic study, and then if possible, some metrics on the results of that traffic study and further requirements, just to try to institutionalize that process and make it more useful rather than just a delay. I think on page 28, section 5.4.7, we talk about public and private streets. I think we need 3 categories. There's public streets, of course, and then some private streets are, people would look at them and say, hey, that's just a parking lot. And it's really insightful to look at a map of the private streets we currently have in Beaufort. And some of them are streets that probably should be public, but a lot of them are just, that's a parking, and there's probably a good term for it, but a U-shaped parking lot that wraps around through a development. So I think we might want to look at it through the lens of not just those 2 classifications. I think it's worth having some discussion on the, for open space, well, 2 things. We have an open space zoning category, but there's nothing in the open space here that talks about the open space district. I think there should be some wording that if proposed open space meets the requirements of the open space district, then it should be zoned as open space district. It's worth having a discussion on the 50% requirement for recreational use. I don't know if that's the exact words, but is that number, hard and fast, and should there be some flexibility in the application of that? And then finally, if we're going to allow a retention pond to be open space if they install a bench, as in 5.5.5, E5 on page 40, I think we may need to have some stronger standards on when a retention pond can count as open space and not just a fence-lined pond with a bench. Oh, and finally, we talked about cluster. Just a bit of background for people who might not know. We have 1 cluster zone in the town right now, RC5. There's 1 development in town that uses that, the Oaks. Since the town has introduced RS5, there's a good argument that there was no reason for a developer to ever choose RC5 over RS5, as RS5 allows for a much higher density with very little trade-off. So while I think cluster is worth pursuing, we may want to consider it just a placeholder in the subdivision ordinance until such time as the town can evaluate our zones and see if we want to go into more, revise the cluster development, or it may not be all that helpful in the short term.
Good idea.
Development.
George, we'll come back to you. Commissioner Matthews, as you.
Yes, thank you.
Am I missing you down there by any chance?
Yeah,
No?
I'm going to make a statement.
Okay.
You want to go first?
I'm going to get to LaPiccolo first, then I'll come back to
Sure.
you.
Go ahead.
I had a question regarding kind of the whole, looking at Chapter 151 and the town's basically adoption of 151 as our flood management prevention. And what this new chapter does, or new provision does, Section 6, is it basically is wrapping flood prevention, though, into the town ordinances, correct? So are we weakening the town's ordinances by wrapping that section into, instead of it being a standalone flood damage prevention code, which carries its own weight, right? I mean, there are civil penalties and so forth that are with that, and then we're wrapping higher regulations into code. How does how do we like make that work, or how do we make that mesh? And I'm concerned about that, because from what I understand, if there's variances between the two, the town's gonna falter with the highest of the two, right? The most restrictive. So if that's then wrapped into our UDO, is that then considered downzoning as well? So maybe one of the attorneys can answer that.
Okay, we're writing this down.
Yes, ma'am, I'll have pages of questions
Okay.
after this meeting as well. Kelly, you want me to give that a shot?
Go for it.
So it's obviously a very good question, and I think downzoning is going to continue to be an issue with anything that we do on the UDO rewrite. It is less so as a general proposition with the subdivision ordinance, because by definition, subdivision ordinance is not a zoning regulation. And I have the same comment for the flood damage prevention ordinance. It is separately provided for not only under 160D, but other state and federal law. And again, by definition, it's not a zoning ordinance, which is specifically what downzoning, the prohibition against downzoning applies to. I don't see a huge risk over incorporating your subdivision ordinance regulations and your FDPO ordinance regulations into one master document. I can't tell you that there's zero risk, but I think it's pretty clear when we assemble the final product, we'll have sections or articles that are clearly labeled subdivision regulations or flood damage prevention ordinance regulations or minimum housing regulations, whatever the case may be. And I think that's a pretty good way to insulate us from having any downzoning crossover, if you will, into a subdivision ordinance or a flood damage prevention ordinance. You can continue to have them set forth separately as standalone ordinances, which is what we have had for years. We changed that a little bit with the 160D rewrites by folding the subdivision ordinance into the LDO. The issue with separate standalone ordinances is consistency, procedure, penalties, the pathway that development approvals take. And one of the big aims of this project was to have a consistent process administratively, a consistent set of rules. If it was a subject matter touching land development. So yes, you can split it out and continue to have standalone ordinances, but you may compromise your desired consistency by having it all in one master UDO, if you will. But I'd be glad to look at that issue in greater detail and continue that dialogue with you, because I think it's a very good point.
Yeah, I have several items to kind of go over, and I'll give you a document afterwards of my concerns. Thank you.
If I could add two things to that. One, you mentioned typically when there's a conflict, the more restrictive provision controls. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We could say if there's a conflict with flood damage prevention article, that controls whether it's more restrictive or less restrictive, so that's always what applies to property. So that's an option.
Currently, though, the freeboard is elevated in this, which is different than Chapter 151, correct? And freeboard
Say that again?
The freeboard requirements are different in the new written ordinance compared to what's in Chapter 151.
Yes, oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah.
If we go back and say, well, which of the two is going to be the most effective, it's going to be the higher amount. And if we're putting that in our UDO, which is really the code, which UDO was the ordinance, which is a land development ordinance instead of the code, then we have a conflict there.
So we would repeal Chapter 151.
So, okay.
So that would go away and it would be, it would be replaced by
Are there
what's.
legal ramifications for repealing Chapter 151? I mean,
Well, yeah, that's
if
right.
anyone would refer, isn't that something that's code? Isn't that something that insurance relies on and so forth, where someone would look up 151 and it's not there.
Well, absolutely, you've got to have a flood damage prevention ordinance. on
Right,
the
and that's
books
state law.
To remain a participating community, and a lot flows from that under federal and state law. I think, you know, I would look at this as a repeal and replace essentially, so a lateral move at most.
So do we have a document, like, do we have a working document that's going to replace it, that's been, or is it just what we have here?
What you're going to get into at the end of the day, and this is probably well down the line and something that Kelly and Tyson and staff and I need to discuss, but when the Board of Commissioners takes action to adopt the final product, that's when you see your repeal language, your recodification language. You know, Chapter 151 is hereby, I use the word repealed loosely, but amended, restated, and transferred to Article 6 of the UDO, and that would be what I would really describe as a legislative history type of document. Muni codes will also pick that up, and it'll be annotated in our code of ordinances. So if the adopting action of the Board of Commissioners is ultimately as I would advise it to be, I think we would be able to clearly track 151 to the new Article 6. Same thing for minimum housing, same thing for subdivision and so forth and so on. But that's going to be a citizen ease of use type of issue, you know. So citizens, you know, we've been looking at 151 for how many decades, and where is it now? And we need to be able to document that when people go to our code of ordinances.
Like I said, 151 as a code carries more teeth to it, doesn't it? As opposed to, like, legally, as opposed to having it in UDO.
No, sir, I don't think so. If you look at the end of your code of ordinances, it specifically.
I was under the impression that there's a civil penalty with code, but not with zoning ordinances.
Well, we have not gotten to the penalty remedy phase yet of the UDO rewrite, but you generally have the same enforcement mechanisms as you would for your code of ordinances generally. Granted, there are certain topics for which you do not have the availability of criminal law enforcement, and the General Assembly has set forth those topics pretty specifically, but fines, stop work orders, injunctions, court action, the whole menu of enforcement mechanisms that you see in your code of ordinances generally are, again, generally available under 160D and should be in your final product of the UDO when we get there.
Thank you.
And one other point to add, and this was a question that we were going to ask when we get to the next steps portion, but staff has heard from the state that the new flood maps will be effective in February of 2027. And because there will be coastal A zones that aren't currently regulated, right, by the current flood damage prevention ordinance, it may be prudent to keep that as a separate ordinance permanently or just for now until the UDO is done, but to go ahead and adopt that prior to the effective date of the new maps early next year.
And that's currently proposed, correct? The coastal A zone standards, which are exceeding the baseline for Chapter 151?
Correct.
Okay, so right now that is more restrictive.
Well, there aren't any coastal A zones, right? Currently, there are no coastal A zones currently mapped in the town of Beaufort, but there will be with the new maps. And so we're putting in the regulations that apply to those coastal A zones to address the map change.
Okay.
All right, Commissioner Matthews, and then we'll come back to you, George.
And we're allowed to approve or cite something that hasn't been adopted? As far as, is that, I mean, because we're basically just saying we're fine with that. They could put in whatever they want and we'll be okay with whatever coastal A zones are.
You mean with the maps?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the maps will be promulgated well before we actually adopt the flood damage prevention ordinance. And however, that is a topic for next steps, I think we'll talk about at some point. But, you know, your typical flood damage prevention ordinance does say whatever the maps are as amended or incorporated into the ordinance. In fact, Michelle, I think we made some amendments in the not-so-distant past to do that very thing. If you cite a specific set of maps, and then the maps change, you have to go through the process of amending your ordinance, which under 160D includes a public hearing and things like that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but if you're talking about maps that you must use and that must be part of the ordinance, and you really don't have any or much local control over what they say, it makes sense to just say whatever the maps are as amended by the federal government, and really the state government is what we're going to travel with.
Did I hear Kelly correctly, though, say that we should consider adopting this before the new maps come out? Did I misunderstand you?
No, that is a question for you all, because the current flood damage prevention ordinance does not regulate coastal A zones because there aren't any mapped coastal A zones in the town. However, we know that the new maps will have coastal A zones, and you don't have, if you keep the current ordinance, you don't have any regulations to address them. And so that is a question for y'all. Does it make sense to go ahead and adopt this revised ordinance in anticipation of regulating those coastal A zone areas?
Before February, is that what you're saying?
Potentially, yeah.
And it would just be the flood part of the ordinances, nothing else?
That would be a question. So we would essentially replace, or I can't remember the terminology you used, Mr. Grady, but replace Chapter 151 and just potentially just keep it standalone, either permanently or just until we get down the road, and then we can plug it back into the UDO if that's the preference of the board.
Okay, so we're going to get Mr. Matthews got the floor next, and we're going to bounce it on to George Stansell, and then we'll move around, okay? Go, Dexter. I'm sorry, you said you were done. I'm sorry.
I've got one more.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you said done.
So in section 6.2.7, there's a waterfront provision that says that all development would be located landward of the reach of mean high tide, and the first line of stable natural vegetation, and comply with CAMA setback requirements, and be elevated so that the bottom of the lower supporting horizontal member is located no lower than the regulation flood protection elevation. Are we able to regulate land that's within CAMA regulation? Are we able to say that that you're not able to build? And it's concerning that it's saying that's all development within reach of mean high tide. Does that also include docks and seawalls and piers and so forth that people have, or even we have in our community for downtown Beaufort?
What page are you on, John?
It's 6.2.
Page 77 of the agenda packet.
Okay.
So everything that we've used in the flood damage prevention ordinance is verbatim from the model state ordinance. So we're using their language and what's required for a local community. As far as coastal A zones, they're basically like a VE zone on the backwater. So we're regulating them similarly to an oceanfront zone, which is why we're seeing some more restrictive language here. I can look into it further. We've also got our floodplain manager, Jeremy, is with us if we have specific technical questions, but as we're kind of talking in this more broad sense, that might be a good conversation to kind of have at a table for all of us to look at and look at coastal A zones a little bit more as we go through the adoption process if we move forward through that.
Okay.
I know I didn't answer your
It's
question.
just the way I read it, seemed that no new development would be allowed within mean high tide.
We can look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, jump in there while you can.
That's right,
Go ahead.
thank you.
Go ahead, sorry.
Thank you. The couple of items that I mentioned, I'll focus in on those, and especially since downzoning was brought up, I'll start with that. There are 15 articles in 160D, And a lot of those articles seem to, as I was looking through those and then reading our draft ordinances, either apply to the entire chapter or will apply to a particular article, or will have language that is similar in the way of enabling legislation for local governments to adopt ordinances. So I came away with looking at the particular ordinance, two ordinances that are before us, and looking at items that might be considered downzoning if the downzoning legislation applied. And it was interesting because even in looking at trying to compare, I guess, the authority in Article 8 that gives us the authority for subdivision regulation, and then going back to the zoning regulation in Article 7. Article 7 has, for instance, a item in it that allows the local government to adopt ordinances that would regulate the percentage of lots that may be occupied, the size of yards, courts, and other open spaces, the density of population, the location and use of buildings, structures, and land. And we get into those types of items in looking at the subdivision ordinance. So then I'm going, okay, well, are you choosing between one particular article and another article to determine where that downzoning legislation would not apply? And is that problematic from a legal perspective? And so I was interested in having counsel look specifically at that and to make sure that we were using the correct article and the downzoning legislation would not apply, given the fact that it might, or at least you would think it might, given that there's similar language in both of those articles to adopt the same type of regulation. So I was interested in legal counsel looking specifically at that downzoning legislation from that perspective, and especially given the interplay among the articles within 160D. And then secondly, which was really interesting to me, when I got to the flood damage prevention ordinance, and it had laid out a number of different areas where the authority exists to adopt those regulations. A lot of the enabling legislation is found in Chapter 153, the Article 21, Part 6, floodway regulation. Logically, that makes a lot of sense that it would. But then if you go back to 160D and Article 9, there's a specific statement in that, and I want to read this. Any local government may enact and enforce floodplain regulation or flood damage prevention regulations as authorized by Part 6 of Article 21 of Chapter 143 of the general statutes, and shall comply with all applicable provisions of that part, and to the extent not inconsistent with that article with this chapter. That's the entire chapter of 160D that you have to comply with. So they have a link between one of the more broad environmental regulations that we're using for the enabling legislation that links you to the entire chapter of 160D where we have the downzoning prohibition. So now I'm concerned that you have that link going on, and can we have any of the downzoning provisions then that would be found to be legally unenforceable, void, if the downzoning legislation applies because of that link. And so I was really having trouble with that, and so what I'm asking for this specific comment is for legal counsel to look directly at those provisions and to come back that we are on sound ground and moving forward with the two ordinances that we're dealing with, giving the links that I just described. And Ari, obviously I'll pull this together and hand you the references so you'll have those to look at.
Thank you, Commissioner, because my response was going to be, I'll need to take a look at it.
I understand, I understand. And then secondly, and this is from comments that I received from many folks in Beaufort on the ordinances. One was the concern that we have ordinances that are protective of the environment. And you can't live in Beaufort and not feel that you want to be protective of the environment, and our ordinances certainly are protective of the environment. Secondly, I would have members that would meet with me and express concern about costs and about, will this allow me to rebuild? Is there any, because you get particular elements that are talked about within the community about, can I rebuild? And what's it going to cost me to rebuild with certain provisions? Is this going to allow me to be able to do that? There was an editorial that appeared in the Carteret News-Times that talked about a fiscal note being done. I don't disagree with that, and in fact, I agree with that, because coming to us, if we have justification for an environmental standard or need within the community that might be increased, that may become more stringent, it seems to me it would be great to have what is the rationale for that increase in that environmental standard in making that decision. And then secondly, what's the cost? Is there an increase in cost in housing? I think every single one of the commissioners and the mayor have expressed concern in the past about having affordable housing. I can't look at all these requirements and tell you how much of an impact it will have on the increased cost of housing in Beaufort. You just can't do that unless you go through a process of gaining that information for us to review in the way of making a sound decision on this ordinance or these two ordinances at this point moving forward. So I'm really requesting that cost data in the way of what the costs would increase from these regulations if they went into effect, what that would be for the citizens of Beaufort, and then secondly, with any of the increases for more stringent regulations, what's the justification for that? If there's a federal requirement or a state requirement, which was cited in a couple of these areas that those regulations had increased, so we have to increase particular regulations, then I totally understand that. But in areas where we feel like a particular regulation needs to be more stringent, period, outside of that scope of what the feds or state regulations require, why are we adopting what we're adopting? You know, what is the harm that is out there that's in jeopardy, and is the particular regulation addressing that, and in what frame? If we have that type of information before us in making the decision on any of these new ordinances, we will make a better decision. And so really what I'm looking for is just that, is that the costs for the regulation are identified, and then the particular regulation, what's the justification for that particular regulation? And that, for me, that makes a lot of sense, and it'll help us make a sound decision for the citizens of Beaufort. And then the last area I'll mention is the definitions, and I did get to talk to Michelle a little bit about this earlier today. There are no definitions that are shown for the flood prevention, the flood damage ordinance. She told me the definitions that we currently have in our existing ordinance would ultimately be transferred over for, I guess, for the entire UDO, and the specific regulations that are in the flood damage prevention ordinance currently, that would be pulled over as well. In reviewing any of these ordinances, definitions are critical.
Certainly.
How the particular terms are defined is critical. I can tell you this, in writing rules and statutes, you can write any amount of new regulations that you want to write if I can write the definitions. Because if I write the definitions, I can formulate the definitions to where I want them to apply and who I want them to apply to. So it's critical that those definitions be a part of our review with any of these new ordinances that we're looking at. So some reference that the public understands to look at those definitions in reviewing the ordinance, and then are there any new terms within the particular ordinance that has been drafted? And there probably are some new terms that are going to need to be defined as well. Those need to be defined in a part of our discussion. So those were the broad areas. I do have a number of additional comments and questions, but I'll hold on those for now. So thank you.
Can I respond real quickly to your
Please do.
last comment? I completely agree on definitions. They're critical to understanding and interpreting the ordinance. We are consolidating most of them into their own article, just that helps with consistency. That one, we typically do in red line so that you can see where things are changing for the very reasons that you cited. They're so important, and we want to make sure that everybody understands the implications of a potential definition change. So what we can do, we are sort of, it's a working document, but we can provide that to you in its current form whenever you see a draft. We can go ahead and give you that document as it stands today. As for the flood damage prevention, the definitions are in that one. They're the very last section, 6.4. Yeah, and so because they're very specific to the flood damage prevention ordinance, it makes sense to keep those with that ordinance, but certainly if you prefer them incorporated into the article with all the other UDO definitions, assuming you keep that flood ordinance in the UDO, we can do that as well.
Yeah, and I may have said flood for that particular one, the subdivision ordinance is where I believe that the definitions do not appear.
That's correct, yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Sanciel, you're up next. Is there anybody else? We're going to go to Commissioner Gillikin and then Commissioner Spiegler.
I just wanted to follow up on a couple things that Ryan talked about. I'm passionate about street trees in any of our areas, and I think they should be required. And also street lights, to be honest with you. But street trees, I'm not sure why we would say they're required in one type of subdivision versus another. Also, as it relates to traffic studies, I'm not sure if you were talking, Ryan, about a traffic impact analysis. Okay, because that's a much bigger deal than just a traffic study. And that is typically initiated by one of two things. One is that in the ordinance, we can say a subdivision of a certain number of units, or that generates, and there are tables for this, generates a certain amount of traffic. And that's generally how it's done. And then also NCDOT, when you're connecting to one of their roads, which seems like we're almost always doing that, they then might require a TIA, so that the developer has to provide certain improvements at intersections. And it's intersections that are typically studied. It's not roadways and that kind of thing. It's typically intersections that are studied in a TIA. But it's usually an expensive process too. And then I had a lot of concerns. I won't talk about all of them that relate to townhome development. I feel like I would like to see the number of connected units limited to like 5. These buildings that are 8 units are massive buildings. And the type of streetscape that you end up with when you have buildings that are 8 units connected and such large buildings close to the street, it's a terrible streetscape. So I'd like to see those limited to at least 5. I'd like to see in our ordinance that with townhomes, you have to step them back and forth a minimum amount of feet, like say 2 feet. And that keeps you from having this constant elevation along the streetscape. I'd like to see, in addition to street trees, there's no reason that alleys can't have some type of tree, whether it's a large tree or a smaller tree, because a lot of times the alleys are very visible. Many times they're used as connectors, and it's a much better streetscape if those alleys have trees in between the spaces, and I think we're requiring something like a minimum of 8 feet between the driveway and the lot. I think that's what it is. But in that 8-foot area, there's no reason you can't have flowering trees or street trees. Will there be a separate block length for townhomes? And again, graphics would be very, very helpful. And then I don't know how much you can regulate this, and our council might be able to answer, but the actual elevations of townhomes where garages dominate the front of the unit, is there any way that we can regulate that? In other words, when garages are on the main street as opposed to in an alley.
Is that a question directed to somebody, or you speaking to council? Okay.
You mean as in not allow garages on the primary street? Is that where you're heading?
When the garage is on the primary street, can the building elevation be regulated such that the garage is not the predominant element?
Or they're in the rear, right? Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
I don't know of any prohibition off the top of my head, no, sir. It'd be subject to what the actual rule is. But I don't know of anything that would prevent us from going there.
Thank you.
There let me ask staff, are townhouses under the residential code? They are under the residential code. So there is something in 160D, and I can't think of the citation right now, that limits how much we can regulate the design of buildings.
That's why I was asking.
Yeah, but I don't know, I'd have to look at the language of that, because I'm not sure if it's more materials or if, offsetting the garage from the face of the townhouse would be allowable under that, but we can definitely look at that.
Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Gilligan?
Glad that Commissioner Matthews brought up the fiscal analysis for rules that might be potentially more stringent, but I would also say in the example of the flood damage prevention ordinance, that what if we didn't do anything? So I'll use, freeboard as an example. That could be pretty costly to the citizens and the homeowner if we did nothing on freeboard as water levels are rising. So I'd also be curious about the other side of the fiscal coin on that one. And I don't necessarily think the flood damage is about environment. It's more about, to me, protection of life and property, and more about the cost of response to threats to life and property versus the cost of preparation or building before the threat. The second thing is that I'm not remembering, and I looked at my notes from the steering committee about why we said street trees don't have to, or street trees can be optional for R8. I can't remember what the conversation was, and I didn't take detailed notes on it. So I am interested in revisiting that, because I do want to maximize the street trees as much as possible. So I would appreciate a revisit on that. And then, Ryan, you mentioned perhaps kind of putting the cluster discussion to the side. And if we do decide, I would just request that we have the conversation in tandem about RS5
Because if we're gonna attract people to cluster, then we also need to, at the same time, figure out how we might wanna dissuade from RS5s. I think it could be a pretty complicated conversation, but when I think of examples of good clusters, I get excited about them, like the one in Atlantic Beach with the tall, skinny buildings and the dunescape. So I don't want to abandon the idea completely, but with the acknowledgement that RS5 just goes hand in hand with that conversation. And I have some other things that I'll submit via email, but just wanted to bring those up for now.
Thank you. Commissioner Spiegler?
Well, I think a lot of people have talked, and I just want to say thank you for all the comments. I agree with a lot of them. I think, Paula, your concerns about if we do nothing, what are the fiscal impacts? I think we need to be really careful about that, because this is about protecting life and property and the cost of responding to that too by the town staff and the homeowners, and we want to try to keep the costs down by doing prevention as much as possible. George, I want to go back to what you said about garages. I actually very much agree with that. When I walk through our developments now and I see the garages like front and center, it gives me heartburn. It may be because my hometown did not allow garages in the front at all. And that's just, that was the way the community wanted it. And maybe that's not the way we go. Maybe we're not that extreme, but I really don't like seeing them as like, that's the front of it doesn't allow for community feel or connectivity, or your neighbors are outside on their porch, and that creates the community feel between houses. So I think that's really important, and we should understand like what we are and aren't allowed to regulate, because maybe our hands are tied or maybe they're not. So I think that was a really good suggestion. I have some other very similar concerns about the townhomes that you do. I would love to, if we are allowed to, limit it to, like you said, maybe 5 units instead of 8, 10, 15 units long, these huge buildings. I think that also does not help with the connectivity in the community. And to go back to that on slide, I think it was slide 18 about this townhouse subdivision, I would like to know more about that, because I had a concern. Let me find slide 18. So for townhouses on lots that are less than 24 feet wide, requiring rear alley access, I would be very careful with that, considering what's behind it. Is it an already established neighborhood? Are there other townhomes behind that? And I say that because we had townhomes built in the back of our community that are single-family homes, and they did not allow parking behind the townhomes. If they had allowed that parking, we would have, we have 18 condos in our backyard, so we would have 18 times 2 cars going back and forth in our backyards constantly when I have little kids playing back there, and that's dangerous. So I would be really careful with this, and this is the first time I'm seeing this actually, so I would think really carefully about what's behind that. If it's more townhouses, then maybe it's okay. But what is the type of zoning behind that townhouse? So I think, George, your point about townhouses, and we need to think very carefully about that, I think that's a really good point. And I agree with all the tree comments that have been made. Let's put them in the alleys. Let's put them everywhere we can. That makes for a better community. I also want to go to some of Ryan's points. So I think the open space requirements, and that's on slide 10. When I read through that in the UDO, there was the recommendation that at least 50% of open space be dedicated to active recreation area, and I would like to discuss that more. Do we really want to be that prescriptive? What if it's trees, and what if it's sort of like natural area? Is that okay, or do we need to put like a ball field in or something? I would probably be fine with it being like a forest. So I think 50%, that's a pretty high number to require it be active recreation. I'd like to have this group maybe discuss that again to see if we want to lower that number. I agree with Ryan's comment about the open space zoning district. I think we should look at that and how we can use that tool to really, we have that tool, so let's use it. How can we incorporate that into these ordinances? And then I think my last comment is about the sidewalks. I know everybody in here has heard me say this many, many times before. I would like to see sidewalks required on both sides of the street, no matter where we develop. Everybody has heard me say this many times. It's a safety issue, it's a community issue, it's an access issue, it's an equality issue. We need to have sidewalks on both sides. I think it looks really lazy in a development when you have sidewalks on one side. It looks like you forgot to finish the other side. But also, like, we are developing in Beaufort. We're not the rural countryside. We're only going to become more urban. And so anything in our town limits, I really think should have sidewalks on both sides. If you get out into Carteret County, outside of the town where it's more rural, that's a different discussion. If the county commissioners are discussing this, maybe they think differently about, do we do sidewalks everywhere or not? But we are within a town that's only continuing to grow. If we have to go back later and put the sidewalks in, it's so much harder, it's so much more expensive. And again, it just creates a community where people are outside talking to their neighbors, playing with their kids. It attracts young families because you can have kids outside much easier. It's much safer. We already have challenges attracting young families to our town. This is a retirement community. We all know that. And that's great. We're having older and retired people move here, but let's attract young families too. And sidewalks on both sides is a really great way to do that. And I strongly believe it shouldn't matter how much money your family has, you deserve to have sidewalks on both sides of the street. So I'm going to continue to push for that. Let's do that. Let's do it right now. So I think that's pretty much all of my comments right now. Yeah.
Mr. Rungden Hill, thank you.
Got a quick statement. Not sure everybody can hear me, but your flood damage prevention ordinance, your consultant
Need it for the
mentioned.
people online.
Your consultant mentioned that you may want to wait because of the maps that may or may not come out in February of 2027. Your current base elevation for a house in Beaufort, the vast majority of the houses in Beaufort are built at 1 feet above the BFE with a bunch of substandard non-conforming houses, which are below. There needs to be some research done if you can make a provision that existing houses can be added onto at the old requirement. If you add onto a house and you built it yesterday and it's 1.1 inch, 1 foot 1 inch above the BFE, if you, according to the model ordinance, if you want to build on it once that's in place, you want to add on to your living room, you can't. So it's great to have a 2 foot BFE. It actually has the potential to reduce your constituents' insurance rates if they talk to their insurance company. But I think you need to look into getting the staff and poor Jeremy in a place where he can live for those people who want to add on their house that are existing. Just a concern. And I think I would advocate that you wait until the new maps are out. Thank you.
Any further comments on this section before I start to wrap it up and allow them to move on to next steps? Yes, Ms.
More of a
Hunsucker?
It's more of a comment
Okay.
than a question. I guess I would like to see a little more consistency in these new subdivision designs going back to the CAMA future land use plans. It seems like it's very broad and it's not as prescriptive as what CAMA has given us. So I really feel like we should look at that a little more in terms of how are they going to align. So we never lose our current zoning, we're going to go to future land use planning. Are we thinking about consistency in those approaches?
Okay. All right, so Kelly, I think we've peppered you with some questions. We're going to move on to the next step because I know we have a community engagement that we're going to probably get to next.
I'm going to turn it over to Tyson.
Okay. All righty. When we met with you all in February and talked about your options under the downzoning bill, we were about 15 months, I guess, past the time where the downzoning bill was adopted. And I think it's safe to say during that first year, almost everybody thought that there would be a very high likelihood that the downzoning bill would be immediately reversed or dealt with in that legislative session in 2025. That obviously didn't happen. And when I was here in February, we were talking, there were still a few strings of hope out there, and if that was where you'd like to see it to go, that it would be repealed. Since that time, we've been through another half session, and essentially nothing has happened on it. In fact, if we read tea leaves, there was one jurisdiction, you may recall, Mills River, in western part of the state near Asheville, that was exempted in the original bill from its application, and they lost that exemption during this year. So if anything, it would seem like there's a reluctance to back away from the notion that underlies the bill. I've put it here in case we want to refer back to it. There are three main components to the bill. One you might call density, the second you might call permitted uses, and the third would be non-conforming uses. So we may refer back to that as we're talking here. What we said to you in February was that following development of Module 4 subdivision, we would come back to you and regroup, tell you what we know. So what I just shared is some of what I know. Beyond that, it truly would be tea leaves, I do think. You're not the only jurisdiction for sure in the state that's wondering what to do with their UDO. And the jurisdictions are taking a number of approaches, although I do wonder if we're not coalescing sort of in terms around a particular approach that I think recognizes that this is probably the landscape for the duration. The only other thing I guess I could offer on this is some perspective. We do work in a number of states, and these types of bills, these preemption bills, are increasingly common, not less. So I don't know if that'll be the case here or not, but they'll offer you that. So similar to our discussion in February, I'm going to lay out 4 options as I see them. You can add to it if you like. I'm going to mention each of them very quickly, and then I'll come back to them. But the first would be that we've done Module 1, much of which was impacted by the downzoning bill or the failure to have it repealed. And we've done Module 4 now. So one option would be to say, what we'd like to do is to take those two and incorporate those into the LDO. Okay? What you have now, we would just morph what we've worked on so far into the LDO. As was alluded to earlier, there's sort of this wondering if we add Module 5 to that, which is procedure, which largely I think you can deal with without worrying about 382, because I think staff feels this way, area may feel this way, that needs to be addressed. It certainly ties into subdivision. The second option would be sort of the flip of that, would be say, we're going to go into the new UDO format. We're not going to change anything substantive to the topics that were in Module 2 and 3. We're done making changes. We'll move those into the UDO format, which would mean you'd have a better formatting system. You'd have these things unified. You could have, we do have already, more graphics and illustrations, that sort of modernization piece. And again, the decision of do you add, Module 5 in there and go ahead and make substantive changes or updates to the processes. The third, which I think might be sort of where jurisdictions are now, given that we've been through the 2-year session and didn't have any changes to the downzoning bill, is moving forward and trying and drafting the UDO, making the decisions you want to make, implement the goals you want to achieve in compliance with 382. So that would be, in your context, would be finishing modules 2 and 3, much of which is subject to the downzoning bill because it's zoning, but which can be attacked from a perspective that would be compliant with 382. Because, for example, it doesn't limit the number of uses or decrease the number of uses, or doesn't, in every case on the face, decrease density, or doesn't cause a nonconformity. Some of those are procedural. So nonconformities, for example, you can address by saying this new regulation, while more restrictive than what we have now, only applies to new development. So if you're there now, if you're either entitled, like you've gotten your approval, or you've built, you get that forever. So we take away that traditional idea of amortizing is not the right word, but of moving away, bringing things into conformance when they're expanded or rebuilt, et cetera. So we kind of go to this thing where you're locked in because of the downzoning bill, but we can move forward with new development having new standards. So my point is this, is that if you wanted us to go through, finish the UDO process compliant with 382, in constant consultation with Mr. Grady, that's something we can do. We're doing that in other jurisdictions right now. So that's option 3. Option 4 would be, you may recall talking about this in February, and that is taking just a very hard position that 382 does not apply to repeal and replace. It's not intended to address full-scale rezonings. It's not intended to address full-scale rewrites of zoning codes in UDOs. It's meant to just focus on case-by-case rezonings, like a parcel here, a parcel there. I think that's a decision for the client to make, I suppose. But that would be a very firm tack to take, and at any rate, that depends on how adventurous you feel, I guess. But the first 3 options, I think, are generally speaking all good ones. I think it just sort of depends on how you like to see the project wrap up. One final thing I'll say, and I'll turn it over to the chair, but the thing to think about is, you noticed in Module 4 there are a number of references to things that are in Modules 2 and 3. So subdivision will overlap with trees, for example, maybe a few other areas. So just bear that in mind, I think, when you're just deciding on an option to take.
Well, we've got a question over here. Do you want
Well,
to
I was
take any
going to
question?
say that, I mean, it seems to me like, for instance, Module 3 and 4 really go hand in hand, because it's subdivision and then it's design. It's all of the elements of design that apply to Module 4. I was just wondering why you left that out in any of these options except 4.
Well, if I understand the question correctly, I think the sense was that those topics were more squarely in the zoning category. The board in February said, look, don't mess with anything that's not clearly outside of 382. So I think of what you're touching on can be dealt with, but I think it's clearly in the jurisdiction of 382.
Any questions?
Well, that was a really helpful review, and I really appreciate that. I think you're right. The past 2 years, we thought maybe there'd be changes, and there haven't been changes. And I'm going to take a different tack, though, and say there could be changes coming up, because we do have an election coming up this fall, and there's so much uncertainty, we just don't know. But the election is really only, 3 months away? And so it could be possible in the next 3 to 6 months that there actually are some very large changes. It's possible that the downzoning law gets repealed. I don't think we can count on that by any means. But we're not talking, 5 years from now. We're talking 3 to 6 months that there is a possibility of some large changes, depending on what happens with the election this fall. And I think we should keep that in mind. I don't know if that, we say that's why we're making this decision, but I think it should be something, in our heads as we're thinking through this process. Elections often cause things to change, and we know we have one coming up soon, so.
Can I look at option 3 again, please?
Sure thing.
Here you are including all 5 modules, correct?
That's right.
Do you recall back when, I guess it was it February? That I asked that we do this, all 5. But it was because of the downzoning, and I stated then that we should not be too concerned because the legislature was really iffy about it. But it felt that it was to do modular 1, and I guess modular 4. But now you're asking us to look at option 3, which would include all 5.
Well, I'm presenting that as one of 4 options for y'all to decide.
Yes, sir, 1 of 4.
Yes, sir.
So And with the legislation still up in the air about the downzoning, I mean, what do you feel the direction they might take concerning the downzoning? I mean, just your observation. I mean, I'm not asking you to say, yeah, now, and I know our legislators can be very iffy about it, and they have been iffy because they have not settled this thing. But if we are to consider it, we have to feel like something is going to happen.
Sure.
I don't know if it's going to be a repeal. I believe they're going to move forward.
Right. Well, I couldn't speculate. I mean, I really can't because of the reasons you said. I think option 3 is the one that you would consider if you think it's not going to change, or I don't feel comfortable that it is going to change, and we need to move forward with our planning and our zoning in Beaufort. So we're going to move forward. We're going to tell the consultants to draft as if 382 applies to everything. And if you can't draft consistent with it, you don't touch that topic. You know, if there's a sense that maybe something else will happen, things will change, I think you might look at 1 and 2. Or maybe option 5 is wait longer, you know, and maybe the election will make a difference. But I don't know, in my opening comments, maybe I hinted at my sense, but it's only a sense. I mean, I really couldn't say.
You got to get that magic 8 ball.
That's it.
Oh, there you go.
That's right. Mine's broken.
Well, I would think that since they have not, and it's still, and talking to a few others that, you know, I think basically, I think they're gonna move forward with it. Once again, that's just talking to a few people and their observation and feeling as well. So I like 3, but we're not asking to really move forward on any of the options yet, are we? Are you asking us on any of the options moving forward?
No, I'm just following up from February to ask you all what you all want to do. We will do whatever that is, yeah.
I
Is
guess,
that a decision? Hold on, I've got, wait a minute. I've
Yeah,
got a
and
few
I
other
asked
people.
after that.
Yeah, so I've got Vic coming up first. I've got Dexter, I've got Paula, then I've got Ryan, then I've got you. Okay, everybody remember your numbers.
I like what Commissioner Spiegler pointed out, that we're not quite sure if the election is going to have an effect on this or not. Simply based on what I heard tonight on Module 4 on subdivisions and flood damage control, I think the steering committee could easily continue working on that if we can gather all of the comments and straighten out those 2 modules, and then maybe we have an additional meeting like this presenting the final Module 4, and then discuss what's the next step at that point.
I like that. Go ahead, Dexter.
Operating under an assumption that a law is going to change is very dangerous. I wouldn't ever recommend anyone do that. The law is what it is, and you need to comply with it. If it changes in the future, okay, then you can take an action based upon that. Obviously, I have some concerns about the 2 ordinances that we're currently looking at, and having council even looking at those, even though we thought we were going in with an area that was clearly outside of that downzoning legislation, and I feel very strongly that it needs to be looked at. Whatever action we take, as far as I'm concerned, needs to be viewed from the perspective of what the law currently is. If there's revisions in the future, there's changes in the future, make those then, but comply with the law as it's written now. You also have the particular language within the downzoning part of the law now that says initiate, that you can't initiate. I still have grave concerns about that. You know, what liability does the town have if we initiate actions that it will result in downzoning, and whether or not that applies to our decisions? And our decisions should be based upon the fact that we will not initiate anything that results in a downzoning. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Okay. You remember your order? Paula, you're next, I think.
In option number 3, did I hear you say apply downzoning statute to all of the UDO, but why would you apply it to all the UDO if you've got the statement only green portions?
Okay.
I guess that's tripping me up for that option. If you
Sure.
can clarify that.
This was our guess in February, and it's pretty close still, that about half the things, let's say in Module 2, could be dealt with, either because it's not touched at all by the 382, or you can comply with 382. So for example, just to take a very simple example, 382 says without the written consent of the owner. So maybe there are things that can be incentivized that otherwise couldn't be mandated because of 382, and if incentivized, comply with 382. So our sense was, again, guessing that on 2 and 3, probably about half the stuff could be dealt with safely. Maybe half of it would just be off limits because of 382, or
Okay.
too risky.
And then if the law did change in the future, do you see that we can do this in a clean enough way to just take that lens of 160D out cleanly and quickly?
Oh. Both?
Good question.
You mean just reverse? So if you said something's incentivized now, 382 went away, you want to go back and make it mandatory? Yeah, that would, it could be easily done. I don't know, quick or clean, but
Yeah, that would just be I would be curious about how that would look to take the downzoning piece away when it's time, if it is ever time.
yeah, it'd be a rewrite, the word you used?
I guess it depends on how it's written to begin with. I mean,
Yeah.
if you apply, if you do, like Tyson was saying, if it's incentive-based, then you can just change it from incentive to a requirement. It could just be a matter of changing the applicability. Like, instead of some standard applying only to new development, you could apply it to new development and changes to existing development. So there could be minor changes like that could easily be undone, but then certain things, it might be more complicated.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Ryan?
Yeah, is it fair to, so option 3 again, is it fair to characterize this that for all sections of these modules that are in conflict with 382, that we would say that existing landowners have a vested right to the current LDO?
That's an option, yeah.
And that any changes would apply only to voluntary zoning changes?
Right.
Okay. And in the case where 382 goes away, might just be a simple matter of removing the language that says you have a vested right to the previous LDO. As soon as we're legally able to, we just strike that wording, and now it's all in force for all zoning districts.
I'm always just hesitant to say anything drafting a code like is simple, but yes, I mean,
But essentially,
straightforward, I would
okay.
say, for sure.
All right, so it is, it does seem
Yeah.
not all that convoluted.
Okay. Commissioner Spiegler?
I think most of my comments have really been said. I was actually going to say something very similar to Vic, but you said it probably way better than I was going to say it of, we have probably enough work to do for the next 2 to 3 months that we could easily revisit this around the time of the election. I would strongly support option 3 because I think so the public can understand, there are many regulations we can put into place that say if a homeowner does this, we will allow you to, not have to follow this, or you get an extra incentive. So it's incentive versus regulation with zoning. And we had discussed this at the beginning 2 years ago and decided not to take that tack just because of some of the limitations of it. But we could easily do that for these portions, and that would not put us in conflict with 382 at all. So there'd be no legal ramifications. It's just a little bit of a different way to approach it. Is it better or worse? We don't really know because a lot of this is new anyways. So I think that would be really reasonable to move forward with all the modules, thinking about the incentive-based system, how we can accomplish our goals. With that being said, I also think we have a couple months of, getting this current subdivision and flood one up to date, and so we might not need to decide today. Maybe when we wrap that up is when we would, unless you think like we need to start this right now, but that would
This is
sort
up-
of be my
all this
opinion,
is
is
up to
to
you
take
all.
Vic's approach.
I'll add one thing. In Pasquotank County, we're doing an update, and the approach has been 3, basically. So what we've done is we've just worked very closely with the planning director and the county attorney, and when we feel like a 382 question has arisen, we bring it to their attention. And you've seen all the footnotes that our drafts have. They start saying, just something to think about. This is something to think about. And, you know, the typical situation there is they interpret it, they say, I think you're okay, or no, I do think this is a concern. And I would envision option 3, including that discussion when the draft, you'd see what it looks like. We could identify for you all where we think there are areas of risk, and y'all decide. Now that I've seen it, I think we're okay, or I think it's worth it, or now that I've seen it, I don't. But
I'm just curious, is your firm the one in charge of leading the Pasquotank process? Okay, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Commissioner Matthews?
Just following up on that same discussion, so that any area that you came to that would meet that definition in consultation with legal counsel, then you would write it from the perspective or propose it from the perspective of incentive-based or with the homeowner's approval or landowner's approval.
or something that we feel like reasonably complies with 382.
Complies with 382.
Yeah, so
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a big statement. All right, any further questions? So just kind of to give you a sense of where you want to go next, you want to know if you guys can go ahead and choose a module, if 3 happens to be the module to work on. What I'm hearing from the board is we're going to eat this elephant one bite at a time. So we're going to work on this subdivision, floodplain, and get all those questions answered and kind of clean this up.
Sounds good.
And then, do you feel, if that's the case, in the background, you could be working on something like option 3 simultaneously? Or are you looking to do
Sure.
that separately?
No, we would have drafting to do up front, so
Okay.
for sure.
All righty.
Sound right. So, yeah, we could get that going.
Okay, all right.
The risk, of course, would be that, you
Okay.
don't need it or decide to go a different direction, but
Well, I don't necessarily see any harm with you having to go through and doing an option necessarily, but we do want to still definitely focus on the project at hand that we're talking about today. But I'll leave that up to the board to make that decision. And if you're not comfortable making it tonight, let me know that too. So they could be quietly working behind the scenes on option 1, 2, or 3.
So I support option 3, but again, I feel like it might be worthwhile to wait 2 to 3 months. That's my opinion.
I agree with that. There's plenty that we can do, and part of it is to make sure that what we've done is legally valid and will stand.
I would agree with that too. And the comment was made that Chapter 151 may be replaced completely, and if we don't have a document
Yeah, that could be a
regarding
repeal
that.
and replace.
No, I'm sorry?
That could be a repeal and replace.
Then
151?
We need to have that document available, I think, before we look at anything.
Okay. All right. Anything else? It sounds like the consensus is wait a few months before we start tackling it, and it looks like option 3 would be where we'd like to go. Okay? All righty. All right, we've done some great work. Once again, thank you for the planning board members to be here. I hope everybody had an opportunity to speak their piece. I'm going to give you an opportunity, all of the people, board comments. Ms. Hunsucker, let's start with you. You have any comments you would like to close out with?
Thank you.
All right, thank you for being here. Mr. Fasolino?
Nope, I'd like to recognize the work of Kelly and Tyson. These guys have been with us the whole way, and they're awesome.
Okay, good. Mr. Patton? Okay, thank you. Mr. Sanzio? All right. Mr. Rungden Hill, I love saying your name. All right, thank you for being here. Mr. Neves?
I'd just like to thank the commissioners for having us. It's always very helpful to the planning board to get guidance from the commissioners, and it helps us do our jobs better.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Spiegler?
I'll second that. I think these meetings are really useful, these joint planning board commissioner meetings, and I would support having more of them in the future. And thank you especially to Michelle for all the work. She's been here the whole time too. So thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Gilligan?
Thank you to the staff, consultants, planning board, steering committee, anyone who's had their hand in this work. Really appreciate you and your time.
Commissioner Matthews?
No, I'm good. It's excellent meeting. I appreciate all the input.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Cooper?
Same, kudos.
Thank you. Commissioner Piccolo?
Good meeting, good to see everyone here, and thanks to the committees for all their hard work. Lots of hours put into this behind the scenes, for sure.
Yeah. Well, ditto to everybody. Thank you very much. But I did also want to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Kyle Garner. At one point in time, we talked about consistency, and his name was mentioned, and it's because of his leadership, years of dedication, your compassion, your knowledge, your desire to help everyone that has walked through that door gain what they needed to gain in order to live here in Beaufort is invaluable, and it cannot be replaced. And I'm about to cry because I don't want to see you go, but I understand that you're going to be moving on to greater things. You've enjoyed this time here with the town, and I want you to enjoy the town that you've helped create. So I want to thank you so much. Thank you. Now, before it rains again, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All right, thank you so much.
Oh, that's just nice. Kyle.
All right, thank you, sir.
Short for a
Go next door. Stick around.